Men of Iron, Chapter 30. Adjoining the ancient palace of Westminster, where King Henry IV was then holding his court, there was no less ancient stone building known as the Painted Room. Upon the walls were depicted a series of battle scenes, in long bands, reaching around the room, one above another. Some of the pictures had been painted as far back as the days of Henry III. Others had been added since his time. They chronicled the various wars of the kings of England, and it was from them that the little hall took its name of the Painted Room. This ancient wing, or offshoot, of the main building was more retired from the hurly-burly of outer life than other parts of the palace, and thither to the sick king was very fond of retiring from the business of state, which ever rested more and more heavily upon his shoulder, sometimes to squander in quietness a spare hour or two, sometimes to idle over a favorite book, sometimes to play a game of chess with a favorite courtier. The cold painted walls had been hung with tapestry, and the floor had been spread with Arras carpet. These and the cushioned couches and chairs that stood around gave its gloomy antiquity an air of comfort, an air even of luxury. It was to this favourite retreat of the king's that Myles was brought that morning with his father to face the great Earl of Alban. In the anteroom the little party of princes and nobles, who escorted the father and son, had held a brief consultation. Then the others had entered, leaving Myles and his blind father in charge of Lord Lumley and 2 knights of the court, Sir Reginald Hallwell and Sir Piers Avril. Myles, as he stood patiently waiting, with his father's arm resting in his, could hear the muffled sound of voices from beyond the curtain. Among others he recognized the well-remembered tones of the king. He fancied that he heard his own name mentioned more than once, and then the sound of talking ceased. The next moment the curtain was drawn aside, and the Earl entered the antechamber again. "All is ready, cousin," said he to Lord Falworth in a suppressed voice. "Essex has done as he promised, and Alban is within there now." Then, turning to Myles, speaking in the same low voice, and betraying more agitation than Myles had thought it possible for him to ever show, "Sir Myles," said he, "remember all that has been told you. Ye know what ye have to say and do." Then, without further ado, he took Lord Falworth by the hand, and led the way into the room, Myles following, close behind. The king half sat, half reclined, upon a cushioned seat close to what stood the 2 princes. There were some dozen others present, mostly priests and a few noblemen of high degree, who clustered in a group at a little distance. Myles knew most of them at a glance, having seen them come and go to Scotland Yard. But among them all he singled out only one, the Earl of Alban. He had not seen that face since he was a small child of 8 years. But now that he beheld it again, it fitted instantly and vividly into the remembrance of the time of that terrible scene at Falworth Castle, when he had beheld the then Lord Brookhurst standing above the dead body of Sir John Dale, with the bloody mace clenched in his hand. There were the same heavy black brows, sinister in gloom, the hooked nose, the swarthy cheeks. He even remembered the deep dent in the forehead, where the brows met in a perpetual frown. So it was that upon the face his look centred and rested. The Earl of Alban had just been speaking to some lord who stood beside him, and a half-smile still hung about the corners of his lips. At first, as he looked up at the entrance of the newcomers, there was no other expression. Then suddenly, a flash of recognition, a look of wide-eyed amazement. Then the blood left the cheeks and the lips, and the face grew very pale. Now doubt. He saw at a flash that some great danger overhung him in his sudden coming of his old enemy, for he was as keen and as astute a politician as he was a famous warrior. At least he knew that the eyes of most of those present were fixed keenly and searchingly upon him. After the first start of recognition, his left hand, hanging at his side, gradually closed around the scabbard of his sword, clutching in a device-like grip. Meantime, the Earl of Mackworth had led the blind lord to the king, where both kneeled. "Why, how now, my lord?" said the king. "I thought it was our young paladin whom we knighted at Delvin that was to be presented, and here ye bring this old man, a blind man." What is the meaning of this?" "Majesty," said the Earl, "I have taken this chance to bring to your merciful consideration one who has most wilfully and unjustly suffered from your anger. Yonder stands the young knight of whom we speak, and this his father, Gilbert Reginald, formerly Lord Falworth, who craves mercy and justice at your hands." "Falworth," said the king, placing his hand to his head. "The name is not strange to my ears, but I cannot place it. My head has troubled me sorely today, and I cannot remember." At this point the Earl of Alban came quietly and deliberately forward. "Sire," said he, "pardon my boldness in so venturing to address you, but I can bring the name more closely to your mind. He is, as my Lord Mackworth said, the former Lord Falworth, the outlawed, attainted traitor, so declared for the harbouring of Sir John Dale, who was one of those who sought your Majesty's life at Windsor 11 years ago. Sire, he is my enemy as well, and is brought hither by my proclaimed enemies. Should anything occur to my harm, I rest my case in your gracious hands." The dusky red flamed in the king's pale, sickly face in answer, and he rose hastily from his seat. "Aye," said he, "I remember now. I remember the man and the name. Who has dared bring him here before us?" All the dull heaviness of sickness was gone for a moment, and King Henry was King Henry of 10 years ago, as he rolled his eyes balefully from one to another of the courtiers who stood silently around. The Earl of Mackworth shot a covert glance at the Bishop of Winchester, who came forward slowly in answer. "Your Majesty," said he, "here am I, your brother, who beseeched you as your brother not to judge over hastily in this matter. It is true that this man has been adjudged a traitor, but he has been so adjudged without a hearing. I beseech you to listen patiently to whatsoever he may have to say." The king fixed the bishop with a look of the bitterest, deepest anger, holding his nether lip tightly under his teeth, a trick he had when strongly moved with anger, and the bishop's eyes fell under the look. Meantime the Earl of Alban stood calm and stood silent. No doubt he saw that the king's anger was likely to befriend him more than any words that he himself could say, and he endangered his case with no more speech, which could only prove superfluous. At last the king turned a face red and quite swollen with anger to the blind lord, who still kneeled before him. "What have ye to say?" he said in a deep and sullen voice. "Gracious and merciful lord," said the blind nobleman, "I come to you, the fountainhead of justice, craving justice. Sire, I do now and here deny my treason, which denial I could not before make, being both blind and both helpless, and my enemies strong and malignant. But now, sire, heaven has sent me help, and therefore I do acclaim before you that my accuser, William Bushy Brookhurst, Earl of Alban, is a fool, and a foul and a tainted liar in all that he has accused me of, to uphold which allegation, and to defend me, whom I blinded by his own unknightliness, I do offer a champion to prove all that I say, with his body, in combat." The Earl of Mackworth darted a quick look at Myles, who came forward the moment his father had ended, and kneeled beside him. The king offered no interpretation of this speech, but he bent to look heavily with anger upon the young man. "My gracious lord and king," said Myles, "I, the son of the accused, do offer myself as his champion in this cause, beseeching you of your grace leave to prove the truth of the same, being a belted knight by your own grace and of your own creation, and the peer of any who wears spurs." Thereupon rising, he drew his iron gauntlet from his girdle, and flung it clashing down upon the floor. With his heart swelling with anger and the indignation and pity of his blind father, he cried in a loud voice, "I do accuse you, William of Alban, that ye lie vilely as aforesaid, and here cast down my gage, daring you to take it up." The Earl of Alban made as though he would accept the challenge, but the king stopped him. "Stop," he cried hoarsely, "touch not this gage, let it lie, let it lie!" "I tell you, my lord, now then," said he, turning to the others, "tell me what means all this confusion. Who brought this man hither?" He looked from one to another of those who stood silently around, and no one answered. "I see," said he, "ye all have to do with it. It is as my Lord Alban says, ye are his enemies, and ye are my enemies as well. In this I do smell a vile plot. I cannot undo what I have done, and since I have made this young man a knight with my own hands, I cannot deny that he is fit to challenge my lord of Alban. Nevertheless, the High Court of Chivalry shall judge this case. Meantime, said he, turning to the Earl Marshal, who was present, I give you this attainted lord in charge. Convey him presently to the Tower, and let him abide our pleasure there. You may take upon you yon gage, and keep it till it is redeemed according to our pleasure. He stood thoughtfully for a moment, then, raising his eyes, looked fixedly at the Earl. The Earl of Mackworth. I know, he said, that I'm a right sick man, and there are some who are already plotting to overthrow those who have held up my hand with their own strength for all these many years. Then, speaking more directly, my Lord Earl of Mackworth, I see your hand in this before all others. It was ye who so played upon me as to get me to knight this young man, and thus make him worthy to challenge my own Lord of Alban. It was your doing that brought him here today, backed by my own sons and my own brother, and by these noblemen. Then, turning suddenly to the Earl of Alban, Come, my lord, I am weary with all this confusion. Lend me your arm to leave this place. So it was that he left the room, leaning upon the Earl of Alban's arm, and followed by the 2 or 3 of the Alban faction who were present. Your Royal Highness, said the Earl Marshal, I must do the king's bidding, and take this gentleman into arrest. Do your duty, said the prince. We knew it must come to this. Meanwhile he is to be a prisoner of honour, and see that he be well lodged and cared for. You will find my barge at the stairs to convey him down the river. I myself will come this afternoon to do visit upon him.